All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first afternoon session. My name is Valentina Bau from Western Sydney University, and I'm just opening this wonderful panel discussion that we have here today. From Gaza all the way to Gadigal land, I pay my respect to all Indigenous people. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands we stand today. And I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present. So we have a panel discussion on social inclusion as a central goal in transdisciplinary research, lessons on improving inclusion in Philippine value chain. The panel discussion will be convened by Michaela Kujin from SIS0, and I would like to pass this on to Michaela for the panel. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Valentina. Nice to see all of you. This is always the death session after lunch. But we hope it's going to be engaging and that you'll all learn something. We really would like the session to be interactive. We're going to present for maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And then after that, we'd like to have a discussion about your experiences. You can ask us questions about our experiences so that we can do a deeper dive, but it will be an interactive session. In this panel session, we're going to look at what social inclusion has entailed in international research and practice. So some of the tools and things we've developed has wider use, but the focus has been on the project that we've been involved in, all of us sitting here, Agribusiness-led inclusive value chain development for smallholder farming systems in the Philippines. We're going to show you how some of the typical concepts and project design of inclusion often fail if they don't think about certain things and they don't actually achieve the outcomes that they seek. We're going to share some methods and approaches that we've applied to deepen our understanding of inclusion in value chains. And we're also going to talk a bit about the paradoxes inherent in inclusion, particularly in value chains. It's been a transdisciplinary project. And we've been operating in a polycrisis environment, which we will actually talk to you about, which creates a huge amount of complexity, uncertainty, and has made the project quite challenging because it's always ever shifting. So we have Australian researchers on this project, as well as Filipino researchers. And I will just I'll just introduce myself and then get them to introduce themselves, and then we'll start. So I am Michaela Kujin. I've been the project leader on this project, and I'm a sustainability innovation researcher.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anton Palo from the Philippines. I serve as the in-country coordinator for the IVC project, but also the general manager for Foodlink Advocacy Cooperative.
Hi all, I'm Wendy Merritt from Australian National University on Ngunnawal land, Canberra. And I'm integration science researcher, so I work a lot in water and agriculture space. And I guess over the last 10 or 15 years, been working a lot more in the development space. And working with social researchers as well as biophysical scientists to look at some of these complex problems.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Marilu Montiflor. I work in the School of Management at the University of the Philippines, Mindanao. For this project, I am the case study lead for the coffee case study, and I'm into agri-food systems research and action research.
Hi, I'm Lucy Carter. I'm based in Brisbane at CSIRO. I'm a social scientist, and my role in this project has been to focus on social inclusion.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yuyin Piñon from the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. For the past years, I've been also involved on NRM-related projects. And for this particular project, I am part of the IMEL component.
So just a quick summary of what the project's about. It's been a 4-year project that was funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. You'll know them as ACR. We're in our last year, we're almost finishing the project, and during the last 4 years, we've aimed to enhance the design and implementation and adoption of inclusive value chains. We've only focused on 2, coffee and vegetables, as these are key sectors in the Philippines. And we've also been trying to explore some of the issues like post-conflict in Mindanao, which relates to the coffee. We've had a strong emphasis on co-design and co-implementation to ensure that the benefits are across the value chain, but with a specific focus on smallholder farmers and their communities. We also had a key objective of using integrated systems to monitor and track our progress. We also use those integrated systems to understand the context at the beginning of the project. We've been working as a transdisciplinary team, and so we have, of course, researchers, which are the people sitting here, but we've worked very closely with private sector, cooperatives, associations, and with the local government. So I just wanted a show of hands, who's actually worked in value chains? One person, okay. Or supply chains? Yeah, so you might know them as supply chains. We call them value chains because it's about the value added that goes along the supply chain. A lot of people who've worked in agriculture will have touched on value chains because once you're producing product, you will probably be looking for markets for those products. So again, I'll ask you who's worked in value chains, maybe? Okay, a few more. And who's done work on inclusion? Okay, a few more people. Excellent. Yeah. So I'll just do a quick summary. As I've said, value chains is really about creating value across the chain. Each key component, at each key component, you're trying to generate value, and it starts often with production, or actually inputs into the production. And then after that, you go to post-harvest through to trading, and trading is a key component of value chains. In that trading component, you normally have a consolidation. Often that's done through co-ops and associations. Then the distribution and sales. You might have some processing along there. Sometimes that happens on farm or just off farm or further along the value chain. So this is a very stylized diagram. And then all the way to the final consumer who will hopefully receive a product that they want to drink or eat. So they'll get coffee or their vegetables. In all of these stages, there are complex relationships that you have to be built, and complex relations of trust building, negotiation. And that's what we partially looked at in this project. Enhancing inclusion is something in value chains that you have to proactively seek. It doesn't necessarily happen, and we'll talk a bit more about that because for us, participation is not necessarily inclusion. Everybody needs to benefit along the value chain, otherwise they won't participate, but you have to participate in order to benefit in any way. What we've realized is that the process of inclusion is highly dynamic, especially in contexts that we've been working in the Philippines where there are polycrises.
So in this slide, we're just giving you a context, basically the context by which this project was happening from starting with in 2021 all the way to current date. And while the project did start in August of 2021, actually much of the project planning happened pre-COVID. So as you can see and probably imagine, many of the things that we put on paper have been pretty much disrupted by COVID-19 as a very significant disruptor. And even as COVID-19 was still in place, as a pandemic is still running, the area that we're operating in this case Sultan Kudarat, which is a province of the Philippines, was actually visited by a number of concerns. The Philippines in general is actually visited by almost 20 typhoons every year, plus include other issues like armed conflict, etc., which is actually very much happening in Sultan Kudarat up until 2022 when the rebels actually surrendered. And even as these are also going through, we also have the political changes because of elections, local elections, national elections. So it's a lot of changes happening all over the place. And that's just the local level. Many of the things, what we need to understand is that while these value chains are already a system of themselves, they're actually embedded within systems. And the embeddedness, in this case, will be, let's say, looking at the global scenarios, global stage, where we actually see a number of changes as well. Supply chain disruptions, conflicts, international conflicts, that while they may not look, they don't look like they should influence the local activities, they did. So for example, because of the changes in Russia, during the Russia-Ukraine conflict, this actually changed the course of the development spending of, let's say, Germany into defense spending, which eventually actually influenced the activities of Nestle in Sultan Kudarat, because they were actually looking for funds there. Now, what kinds of changes do we actually see in the value chain level? Because we were operating in Sultan Kudarat initially when we planned the program, Nestle was actually the 90% shareholder of the supply for coffee, Robusta, in the area. But when the pandemic happened, the traders had to look for alternative markets. At the end of that, when the areas did open up, Nestle was now the minority player at 10%. It was a complete 180 shift. So you can imagine, okay, now how does that work for our projects and plans? Obviously, what we need to look into here is that adaptability and flexibility is going to be very important, especially in high conflict and high crisis areas, such as the Philippines, and specifically in areas like Sultan Kudarat. Okay.
Thanks, Anton. Just before we get onto this slide, just Vic McWaters in that session, she talked of accelerated serendipity. And the page that I got is talking about complexity thinking and has a table about simple, complicated, and complex problems. And guess what I'm talking about today on this slide? But there's a really interesting quote in here of how international development has been informed from that simple perspective of how change happens, and that it's erroneous to think that these development processes can be planned and controlled, and it's also unethical to think that people can be controlled and change predicted on their behalf. So, I don't know, I burst into laughter as soon as I got that page. In saying that, I suspect that many of you in the room will be quite familiar with this sort of framing of problems as simple, complicated, and complex, this sort of nested sort of framing. And I guess in our project, we do think of inclusion in value chains more broadly than what we're actually doing in the project as very much a complex problem, because it is about trying to achieve systemic change, which we've heard a lot of talk about in this room earlier this morning, and is often involving quite diverse people and groups across community, business, academe, political settings. And so earlier today we heard conversations around trying to keep the voice of the people for whom outcomes are desired or intended in this space. And when we're getting into this very complex space, sometimes those voices can be not in the room or not heard. So I think there are many processes across these scales. So if we actually want to be able to improve inclusion in value chains, we need to understand these. So of relevance to us in our project is household scale. So you've got family dynamics, farm productions, and often in these sorts of value chain projects, the real aspirations and immediate needs and priorities of communities and farmers is not actually thought about as a key research question or knowledge that you need to go in and develop an intervention as well. So we've got interactions between groups, and you'll hear some more discussion around the sort of coffee associations in our Mindanao work. That's led by our fabulous team over here. But then you've also got markets and regional to national government stakeholders and other stakeholders like the traders, us as researchers, or people implementing programs as well. So it is a really complex space, and we don't always agree about what the problems are and what the solution should be. And we don't necessarily have a right to say what those problems are and what those solutions should be as well. So I guess the way we sort of think about complex problems is that they often consist of nested, simple and complicated problems. There's often some little wins that you can get quite quickly to build relationship and trust, but there are other things that take a lot more effort to actually work on if we're trying to look at this. So I guess in the examples that you'll hear a little bit later, if we think about installing a dryer for coffee beans, that's quite a simple solution for farmers to try and improve the quantity and quality of their green coffee beans, to try and get a better price for their beans or to sell it to a premium market. More complicated perhaps might be the strengthening of the coffee associations to try and ensure maintenance and fair access to that dryer with communities and members' decisions around what fair is, not me coming in and imposing what fair is on how this infrastructure should be used. Then if we shift into that sort of complex space, this might entail this strengthening the enabling environment, so around the policy environment, around support perhaps under polycrisis or access to markets, those sorts of things. But also thinking about some of the other aspects that were raised in one of the sessions earlier around resilience and sustainability, particularly in that context of disruptive change and polycrisis. So I guess where our project sits, we're sort of working in that sort of, we've got simple elements, we've got some complicated elements, but we've got that mindset towards complexity, but recognising that we are a 4-year project coming to an end as well, with a focus on research. It is funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, so there is that research element. So in terms of impact and systemic change, we're not up into that, achieving that space at this point. Next bit, thanks. I guess my last point around this is, so my role in the project is linking systems thinking approaches to monitoring, evaluation and learning with UN. And when we're in this sort of more complicated to complex space, tracking evidence of change is actually also quite difficult, because we have this greater uncertainty around what the impacts of our interventions or our work will be. Will they actually affect or achieve the outcomes that we truly want? And what are the things that might stop or speed up that change? We've got these sort of multiple pathways from our intervention to impacts, and these feedbacks and dynamics, some of the things that Anton was talking about. And there's also this uncertainty around the time frame and who needs to be involved. And we can't assume that we've got agreement and buy-in from all stakeholders to actually achieve the outcomes from our project. So I guess we're trying to argue that we really need reflexive, adaptive and holistic approaches to monitoring, evaluation and learning that do draw on a lot of the tools that are heavily used and promoted, such as theories of change and outcome mapping and harvesting and those sorts of things, but are really also centred around building our capabilities as project teams and program implementers and the collaborators that we work with to reflect on what's working, where we need to change things, and how do we ensure that local voices or the community's knowledge is brought in, but we're also doing what they want us to do with them. Thanks.
So we have, as Michaela mentioned earlier, we have 2 case studies, and one of these case study is in Sultan Kudarat. So the 2 main activities that we did is, first is we have to map the context. So mapping the context, we conducted FGDs, KII, to understand the context and nature of the problem. So we will take you to our area. So we will summarize the 4 years project in probably 2 more years, additional 2 years preparation for before the project started. So in just 5 minutes. So please, Michaela.
The inclusion of smallholder farmers in value chains is a pathway to sustainable development of rural communities. This is the Agribusiness-led Inclusive Value Chain Development for Smallholder Farming Systems in the Philippines project, or simply called IVC Philippines. Funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, this is a collaborative effort of a consortium of both Australian and Philippine academic, private sector, and research institutions. Sultan Kudarat, located in the Soxarjan region of the Mindanao Island, is the research locale for the Coffee Inclusive Value Chain project. In this region, 75% of the total areas devoted for coffee farming is in the coastal municipalities of Libac and Calamansig, with more than 17,000 hectares of land, collectively in a total yield of approximately 9,000 metric tons of green coffee beans. However, there has been a number of challenges that need to be addressed, especially for the identified areas for this project. For the Nuling Coffee Growers Association and the Coffee Farmers Association of Hinalaan.
Ang challenges lang sa pagpa-farm, sir, yung trabaho lang, sir. Magpatrabaho, minsan kasi hindi mo makaya, sobrang luwag. Sa usahay nga, dili magasinabtanay, o usa pa jud ang financing amo ang maproblemahan, bro. Masulbad man sad namo.
Wala gid kayo income nga dako, sir. Maliban sa karon nga nagsudod ang inyong grupo kag ang Nestle, natutukan mi, natudluan mi sa mga technician kung paano alagaan ang among kape, kung paano anong gamiton nga bulong pangtambal sa among mga kape nga mga sakit.
Ano yung ning agi sa barila, sir? Oo, basta dako na kaya niya paulol.
Ang ari dati ko siya, sir, kapihan so amo niya la amis ni Faing. Alin nito sa taas, frost na siya, paabot din siya, baba. Amo ni siya, ari picture siya.
IVC Philippines developed and evaluated interventions that contribute to inclusive coffee value chain development for NCGA and COFA. This resulted in several outputs, such as the Rapid Marketing Appraisal or RMA, Farm Systems Analysis, and Inclusive Value Chain Analysis. It also resulted in the development of the Pangandoy and Inclusive Engagement Frameworks. The findings were considered beneficial in the design of their communications and engagements framework, with outputs that included the conduct of academic forums and stakeholders' engagement. The findings were then utilized, which resulted in the identification of several interventions, such as the design of a training module for the organizational capacity and the establishment of a coffee nursery in Barangay Nuling in Libac and an elevated coffee solar dryer in Barangay Hinalaan in Calamansig. And lastly, IVC Philippines was also able to develop the IVC Philippines website that features salient information about the project and implementation outcomes.
Bilang isang miyembro ng COPA, mahalaga ito sa amin kasi kung merong aktibidad, may mapuntahan kami, minsan yung mga may binibigay, nakakasali kami.
Daghan mi nga nakatun-an about sa padagan sa organisasyon, pag-finance o pundo sa among association.
Okay kayo, bali natutukan ini karon mga nakabot sa among mga nakatudlo.
Salamat yun no, sa nagtapang sa mua. Lapi na yun sa mga officer nga wala ginagpabaya sa mua.
Proud po kami na kami natulungan ng IVC Philippines, lalo-lalo na po sa kay Ma'am Malo, sa kay Ma'am J. na Lorente, sa mga speaker po na nagtulong sa NCJA po, malaki po ang aming utang na loob sa kanila.
A beacon of hope shines among community members as the IVC Philippines project closes, leaving more empowered coffee farmers who not only earnestly yearn for more productive yields from their farms, but also seek the betterment and upbuilding of their families and communities.
So as we can see, we have the context. So after that one, we were able to have a co-design intervention. So as mentioned, we have the organizational strengthening, and we also have interventions like the provisions of the all-weather solar dryer. And in additional, as part of our gender strategy, we have developed together with the farmers as well and farmer organizations, a gender-responsive and socially inclusive organizational vision, mission, and goals. When they had organizational strengthening, they drafted the mission and vision, and then from there, we have a gender person, a facilitator, who worked with them for 4 modules, and then they refined the vision, mission, and then did a gender and development plan for the organization. So it's they already did that, and also the business plan. They also had a business plan, and they pitched the business plan to prospective buyers and some other like from the coffee shops. So they presented that one, and to their fellow members as well. So it's been we are emphasizing the co-design because this is something that we know what are the things that needs to be done, but we should also ask them, are these things, do you really need these things, or are you really capable of doing these things? If you need this, but you're not capable, then we can do something about it. That's why we have organizational strengthening, and then we have the gender strategy. So that's how we did for Sultan Kudarat.
So far we've used the phrase social inclusion, and we haven't yet defined our use of that. So I'm going to try and provide you with a definition that took us about 2 years to come to. So traditional ways of looking at social inclusion in agriculture or many other sectors might be numbers of women involved, or numbers of disabled people involved, or income earned. We have resisted that, and we've needed to, and we found out early that that's not sufficient. Participation is necessary, but is not sufficient for engagement. So we see social inclusion as more of a process that seeks to address the needs of diverse people to meet their economic and wellbeing goals. So it's a lot broader than that, and it takes a long time and a lot of facilitation and capacity building to work through that process, both for us as a project team and with all our partners. So we've created a framework that we call IEF. It's multi-purpose. It's helped us stay on track in terms of our definition of inclusion. So we always work back to the IEF when we think a new research activity is a great idea. How does it fit in with the IEF? Are we subjecting people to 60 questions in a survey? That's not about inclusion. So we've also made sure that the IEF guides the development of our tools and methods more broadly, and it also directs us in how we see our research impact. So it's very focused on making sure that inclusion achieves the kinds of things we expect it to achieve, but is actually making it explicit. So there are 5 pillars that we use, and I understand from this morning's conversations that among us we have probably very different definitions of equity and diversity and culture and agency in the room and in the broader room here. So we have resisted to define very, very clearly what these pillars, what these definitions in the pillars we use mean. So we've kept the definition quite broad. We definitely need to think as social inclusion of recognising the multifacetedness of identity and culture. So it's not linear, there's lots of different facets of it. We definitely need to think that agency is important, trust is important, power is important, and in that comes a voice. Equity for us means a number of different things. It means ensuring individuals with diverse interests, capacities and needs are included in processes that affect them. So you'll be familiar that a lot of these pillars are actually related to to very familiar concepts with us, as for example with like decolonisation, transdisciplinary research. So these are very linked to those ideas, but we've made sure that we are explicit about how they work in the way that we look at our value chains. The last 2 pillars are working towards resilience as an outcome, which is important, and there's been a few conversations about that this morning. Again, we haven't defined explicitly what resilience is. We've seen resilience being spoken about and related to individuals at that scale, organisations. We've heard resilience about environmental impact, for example. So we just make sure that whatever we're doing, we're still thinking of resilience in the way that makes sense in the context that we're thinking about it. And our last pillar relates to it, to our vision being scalable, our interventions being scalable, and quite systems focused and systems orientated. Because as the speakers previously have mentioned, we can't stop at thinking about social inclusion in the context of a value chain in itself. It has to be more about inclusive development. We know that farmers don't necessarily want to be looking at economic development primarily. They have other goals such as health, other livelihood goals such as healthy families. So we need to be able to work in a different way towards a goal that might not be explicit in our project, but is looking towards more inclusion in a development process. I think that's it. So if there was one takeaway from that ramble, it's inclusion is about relationships. It's and for us, that's the most important thing. It's not about numbers or dollars. It's about quality of relationships.
Before I go through this slide, I would just like to also mention that there have been a number of reinterpretations of certain terminologies. For example, agribusiness. Agribusiness oftentimes is understood as the lead firm, the larger ones, large companies are participating within these chains that influence pretty much what happens within those value chains. But eventually, and to a certain extent because we had to recognize that any of the value chain actors can actually lead these kinds of these value chains at some point. And therefore, anyone who's actually engaged in some kind of business transaction along the chain can actually be described as being an agribusiness. So, and this probably hints to something I've asked to the question I asked earlier this morning. But as we started investigating and looking into our data sets and trying to make sense of them with regards to the IEF principles, we eventually found that many of these principles are actually manifesting within the practices and within the aspirations of the value chain actors. However, we also began to see that they are paradoxes. They are actually going against each other in certain situations. For example, take a look at identity. On the one hand, it looks at belongingness. You're trying to, the manifestation there is you're trying to be part of a community or at least a group. In this case, let's say a value chain actor being identified as part of the coffee value chain in this case. However, identity is also manifested in terms of finding individuality and uniqueness. And how do we make sense of that? In concrete terms, try to imagine a coffee farmer who initially sells coffee to Nestle. So Nestle wants their coffee, it should look like coffee, it should taste like coffee, it should smell like coffee. At least those are the kinds of product attributes that it should have. But once this farmer decides to, well, there's a potential market for durian coffee. I want to smoke my coffee beans with durian wood. And now it starts to become a different product. That product is valueless to Nestle. They will reject it outright, but another value chain player will actually buy it and potentially through perhaps even provide premiumization in that. So these are the kinds of conflicting or paradoxical situations that we might actually see. Next, please. And this is me, this is in a way a kind of falling into this scenario where it might actually sound binary and even reductive, as was being cautioned earlier. But I would just like to invite everyone to try to imagine, what if these principles actually had scores? So you have, let's say if you had higher agency, you will probably have and see distributed power. But if you had lower agency, you would actually see it much more asymmetrically distributed, like a lead firm actually controlling the entire value chain. So that will actually now apply to agency, voice, equity, and identity. One thing to note is that the traditional understanding of value chain governance actually tends to be very coercive. Coercive in the sense that, I'll try to remember the slide that Michaela showed earlier. The value chain caters to the consumers. If you do not cater to the demands of the consumer, the threat actually is that you will not get paid, or you will not be able to get a share of that value allocation that the consumers pay for. Now, so there's a threat. It may not necessarily be direct, a direct threat or a violent threat, but it is a threat of sorts. If you don't follow through with that demand, then either you don't get enough value or you're actually kicked out of that participation from that chain. So, but once we push these principles to higher levels, we begin now to see that actually a lot of these principles lead towards exclusion, voluntary self-exclusion. And in that sense, okay, if we're pushing for, if inclusion is actually leading to higher levels of exclusion, how do we now make sense of that? This is now the challenge. Where do we now sit along that space? So in a way, it's actually trying to balance, trying to figure out where to put yourselves in at discrete moments. So for example, if the goal actually is to achieve stability, efficiency, and you might want to actually establish more control. Why would you want to do that? Maybe there's a emergency. If this room was on fire, we don't want 20 different opinions on what to do. We want one opinion that says we have to get out of this room immediately, right? Now, however, if we're pushing for empowerment, that actually brings along innovation, but it also comes with disruption. So it seems that rather than having to say this one is correct, that one is correct, or that this one's wrong, that one's wrong. I think it's more about trying to make adjustments, frequent adjustments as to what is necessary in the given context, which apparently does change over time. And across all this, what seems to also be very, as a common denominator, if you really want to pursue development, it looks like we need to go back down to basics. Basic needs, safety, security, all guaranteed upliftment, whether or not you are actually in lower levels of inclusion or higher levels of inclusion. So that, in a way, is the challenge. It's like a tightrope walk. Sometimes you have to adjust to the right, sometimes you have to adjust to the left, just to be able to achieve what's exactly the purpose of your engagement in the chain, but also as developmental workers. Thank you.
Yeah, so as shared by my colleagues, the context of coffee is quite complex. And so, as shared by Malu just a while ago, the activities that we also facilitated in the project sites were also dynamic and also adaptive over the years of project implementation. So maybe for many of us here, we are only familiar with the coffee shops where we get our coffee from. But as you can see in this slide, there are a lot of stakeholders involved. There are a lot of actors. So if we take a look at coffee farmers alone, we see them as coffee farmers, but in the field, there are a lot of subgroups among this farming community. So in the site, you would have big landholders, small landholders. You would have indigenous people engaged in coffee farming, or migrants, or women coffee farmers, and also men coffee farmers, and many others. So each of these farming subgroups would have their own characteristics, socioeconomic, and many others that would somehow influence on how they produce, interact with other actors in the value chain. And another one would be coffee traders, middlemen. But there are overlaps on these two actors, because some coffee traders are also farmers themselves. So that will, also influence or affect on how they act in the value chain. And other important actors in here, we would have the local leaders, at different levels, from the village to the municipal, provincial. And so they would have their own different functions governing coffee production. And national government agencies, which is often they are managing the direction of coffee in the country. And it's not indicated in here, but very important, the private sector, private companies. And as mentioned, the Nestle. So they have a presence in the site, and also non-government organizations and other civil society organizations. So each of these actors or stakeholders in coffee value chain, often they would have their own knowledge, they would have their own perceptions on how to manage coffee within the different, with their involvement in the coffee chain. And in many cases, they also have their own competing goals. They would have their own interest. And so, how to get around with these differing perceptions could be challenging. And then on top of that, if we put inclusion, that would make it more complex. So, in this project, we use the MEL process and also tools together with research methodologies that are related to the systems approach, integrated assessment, to better understand how coffee works in this project site. Next slide. Yeah, so in implementing the IMEL, I actually stands for integrated, so it becomes integrated MEL. So on the right side of the slide with the 3 blue circles, we were actually guided by implementing this framework with 3 questions. So I hope you can read it. So the first one would be, how does the system function? So this is trying to understand the context of coffee in the site, because how coffee works, it's really it varies from one place to another. So that helps us to understand, to frame the problem that we would like to address. And then the second one would be, how can the system be improved? So this is where the co-designing came in. And then the last is how can we track and respond to change? So this is now the tracking of changes in the site. And then this is strengthened, the process is strengthened by the learning, the feedbacking in the project implementation. So on the left side, so these are some of the approaches, methodologies and tools that we used in the project. So there are quite a lot of them. In the middle, you can see the transdisciplinary research process that we used. So there were a lot of methods that we used to help us, understand, frame the problem. And then in the co-production, this is now the co-designing stage of the project until the applying of new knowledge. These are now the activities that we implemented for the interventions. And on the other side, we also used some methods to deepen our understanding on the social dimension of the site. So we also used the pagdadala method, or this is actually the pangandoy. So that's a local term for aspiration. So based on the coffee farming livelihood of the farmers, we would like to understand what are their aspirations in life, the barriers, and what are their coping mechanisms. And then we deepen that on the other side, the scientific side. We deepen that aspirations on how this relates to the bigger system. Because of course coffee is just a small part of the bigger system. So we also used other frameworks, like for example this community adaptation template, for us to understand how the aspirations of coffee farmers relate to their health, their well-being, also their culture, their community, and also their environment. So that enabled us to have a bigger picture, or broader understanding about the coffee farmers. And so so far, using the IML framework, it was exploratory for us. It has been useful, mainly because the context is also complex. So in the process, we were not fixated on a particular approach or method, so that enabled us to also consider other equally important aspects of coffee value chain. And as mentioned just a while ago, their aspirations, because often when we talk about value chain development, it's focused on income. Competitiveness, efficiency, and all. But then, what does this mean to the the aspirations, for example, of coffee farmers? So that, so that's one of the benefits of using this framework.
So, with regards to synthesizing all that, basically, what are the lessons learned? One thing we have to realize that, well, especially in polycrisis contexts, as much as we would love for these crises to not happen during our project timelines, well, they don't cooperate well. They just happen anyway. So for example, we actually had to go through a number of landslides. Well, we didn't enter landslides, but we've seen them a lot. We've actually encountered floods, we've encountered, again, the elections, etc. And in that sense, there's a lot of requirement for flexibility. Again, it's almost like allowing space for being entrepreneurial, opportunistic with regards to the activities. If we had to become rigid about these procedures, we will definitely go nowhere. So again, it does not cooperate, but we need to be able to deliver results given our, our commitments to our donors and even our communities. Now, with regards to right methodologies, as Yuyan mentioned earlier, there's a lot of tools in agriculture that look into yield performance, cash flow performance, etc. But they don't paint a complete picture. When we started looking into, let's say, the Pangandoy as a methodology, it simply asked 3 questions. One, what are your aspirations? Very broad. What are your burdens? What are your coping strategies? And from there, we actually found that many of the priorities of farmers had nothing to do, farming didn't tend to be the topmost priority for these farmers. It tended to be about their children's education. It tended to be about family health. So it seems like the suggestion is, they're already saying that, well, if we want to be able to have better farm performance, we may need to address these concerns first, because that's what they are there for in the first place. Time obviously is essential to build capacity for deep inclusion, but in a way, it actually took us almost 3 years just firming up these relationships with them. Not to suggest that they were aloof with our presence. They were actually very welcoming, but we're also trying to understand where they're coming from. The actual implementations for this project actually all happened in the last year. So, and in rapid succession, only because, and with pretty good adoption and acceptance from the community, especially because we've kept on consulting with them. We try to ask them, did we understand these narratives of yours correctly? So even if they're actually not, grandiose types of interventions like mechanization, etc., they still accepted them and actually found a lot of value in those kinds of interventions. And of course, inclusion is an ongoing process. If it actually begins to seem like there's a lot of work that needs to be done, well, yes, that's actually the case. But at the end of the day, it seems like after having done a lot of relationship building, what seems to really work as well is authenticity. And when they sense that you are authentic with your purpose, they will actually start accepting anyway. So it may not necessarily be clear as to what might actually happen. That's the problem with polycrisis situations. But as long as we're authentic with our partners in the area, even when with conflicting ideas, conflicting intentions, they seem to work it out with us anyway. So there, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That was great. So that's it from us. I don't know if people have any questions. You can either put them on the Wova. How do you say it? Wova? Hoover. Or you can just ask us. We have one question. Okay.
What was the meaning of resilience in the context of the research you did?
No, you go first. So we actually kept it, again, very broad. And we've all been looking at, we may not actually have strong agreements as to how we understand resilience at the moment. For example, I actually, what we can probably see is that definitely the kinds of resilience, let's say, of a value chain in terms of sustainability of its operations, in terms of sustaining its business activities, may not always be the same kind of resilience that is sought out by individual farming systems, or in this case, households. In fact, you might actually begin, in one interpretation we looked into, just playing around with the idea. A household, a farming household, usually just looks into its ability to sustain or provide for the children, provide for the family members. Once you've actually started looking at it from a different kind of perspective, in this case, a farming system, so it's a household together with the other capitals around it. That's a different identity. That's a different role, and many times these are not compatible with each other. So, for example, a coffee farmer is trying to get as much involvement in the value chain, but the chain actually in Sultan Kudarat might not be providing the same or the appropriate amount of income for them. That is going against the objectives of the household, which needs those income, which needs money to be able to sustain itself, to survive. So in that sense, the resilience of their household might actually require getting out of the value chain, which is now incompatible with its identity as a farming system for the coffee value chain. So sorry, it's a very weird response, but that's essentially how we are actually seeing it at the moment.
I'd like to add to that for the coffee case study, because that's what we did on the field. The resilience that it's in there is organizational resilience. That's the reason why we have organizational strengthening after the project. We will leave, but we made sure that they are all registered, they are capacitated, officers are capacitated. So that's the resilience of, and then there's leadership as well. And from that resilience, they can also share it, or it could also resonate with their communities, because they're also community leaders. So that's because the interventions was also on the organizations and their participation in the organization. So that's one. And then if you say that when you have the resilience, I think you saw on the video how they manage with all the, we saw the polycrisis, but that's their way of life. That's how they deal every day. It's just typhoon. It's just another earthquake. That's an everyday, and then they manage to do that. And when you say, because resilience is such a big word, but when you do go into the community, we ask them, what are, so the resilience, for example, for those farmers is making sure that their crops are, they have the crop insurance. So that's one way that they made sure that even if there's typhoons, and they made sure that they can have a little money from that. So that's, it's not how the project defined it, but because contextually, that's how I share for the Sultan Kudarat case. That's the resilience that was manifested in the community.
So my only comment on resilience is it can also relate to the markets. So for these communities, so both for the vegetables and for the coffee, we've mainly spoken about the coffee, having diverse markets actually increases their resilience. When we started the project, we thought having one lead agribusiness, so Jollibee, which is a big fast food company that buys vegetables from farmers to put in their burgers, we thought that would enhance resilience. You've got one person, they're giving you a good price, you're producing the quality that they require, but that actually did not apply in this case. And then also Nestle was the main business in coffee. We thought by working with them, we would ensure resilience for these farmers, and actually it hasn't been that. So the framework is very much about, look at your context. These are 5 pillars that indicate what you should be looking for, but you have to think about what those pillars mean in your context. Is it climate resilience? Is it market resilience? Is it organizational resilience? Is it household resilience? And you can unpack all of those. So we're not trying to be prescriptive. All we're trying to say is these are things you should be thinking about.
Now, I was going to offer you a 4th definition. So you can see now how even we cross disciplines in our own team, and we're the science group, for example. So here, at some time point, we thought resilience for us referred to the longevity and stability of enterprises and entrepreneurs' ability to plan for the future. So that's a component. So it has different components of resilience that my colleagues have spoken of. We recognise that it's complex, it's not clear, it's dynamic, and it's at multiple levels. So we might get ourselves into a pickle when we're trying to write this up for publication. I suspect that's what'll happen. But you can see how critical it is to recognise the complexity in the way that we talk. And if we were to adopt the traditional definition of resilience, I'm not sure we'd be satisfied in this context.
Oh, you had a question, didn't you? You had a question first. Your hand was up earlier. Yeah, you go.
My question is about having diversity. What do you think were the clear advantages and some of the problems associated with having a diversity? Because some of you would be acculturated to the Philippines context, and when it comes to marginalized groups of people, it is a really important factor in terms of their participation and involvement in the project. How did you see it, and what did you encounter?
Oh, the start of the project actually had a number of debates. Of course, we're all coming from different backgrounds, coming from different priorities in terms of what do we want to see from this project. So there's a series of debates, but also the challenge, and I suppose this speaks of the challenge for transdisciplinarity, is the unlearning. We're trying to unlearn as well, bring down our boundaries to try to see why are they trying to insist on certain things while we are trying to insist on others. So it's almost like a laboratory of what's to be expected from the community itself, because government has its own ideas, NGOs have their own ideas, private sector, the farmers, traders, etc. But at the same time, if we didn't understand, and it was pretty much of a crisis, it's like, nah, I don't believe you. Nah, I don't think that. But over time, it's like, okay, that starts to make sense when more information actually comes in. So it's also, in a way, a good exercise to allow a different sort of knowledge generation. It may not necessarily cleanly fit in any discipline, but perhaps that is actually the challenge now and also the benefit of having done this. So it's a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of approach. So for example, the Pangandoy, I think many people were so scared about that because it actually came from a psychosocial approach. But when it was adopted, it proved useful for the purposes of doing a kind of community assessment. It actually broadened our horizons in terms of understanding. So it's a vague answer as well again, but that's just how it seems to me, at least from my perspective.
It's really challenging, especially we're the ones on the field and the one negotiating and also doing the activities on the field. So if we have the high level, so we're the ones brokering between that one. So I can really tell you it's really challenging because we don't have to over promise the community, and there are things that are deliverables for the project. And for example, we're the face of the project, and for us it's a project, and that's all. I think that's also we have to emphasize in the project team. For example, for us who are doing those project in the community, that even if this is something that is a 4-year project for us, this is for the community, their life, their livelihood, and we have to emphasize that our project is inclusion, so nobody left behind. So it's really I think it's really challenging. You have the high level and you have the community, and for us, we're brokering both of them. So I think it's really making sure what is your stand all the time. So our stand really is we want to do things on the project level, but we also want to do things on the community level. And is it something that could be delivered for both ways? That there's nobody who will be compromised or will be disenfranchised, because we're working in inclusion. So we want to include everything. So there's high level and also in the community. And even if there will be changes, we will be communicating that with the community. And that's always the emphasis, that we're there for the project, but the community is there for. So we will not put so much pressure on the people that we work with as well, because if we will say that we want these changes or we want to see these changes in the community, and if there's some tensions in the community, we have to manage that. And these people that we will leave behind will also manage it. So that's why we also have the co-design. That's why the co-design is really very important. It's designing all the things, the intervention, because we understood, of course, we're there to do research and to understand, but we're also there to co-design the intervention with them, to check their capability and how, when we will leave, nobody will be compromised in the community.
I might just add a couple more sentences. I think there's also been, there's this how we work with others outside the project, with our communities, with our collaborators, with those in power who need to give us permission to go somewhere. There's also how we try and work within a project team or a research team. And in both of those sort of areas, I think some of the big learnings that I've got over working in this project and the previous ACR project is really around that sort of research is a negotiated process in this space. You cannot get stuck in a discipline and it's all about facts, it's all objective, this is the way it is. That's out the window in this space. So it's about building those relationships and trust to have these sorts of difficult conversations across disciplines, across perspectives of how and why we should be doing things, and actually working out that space. And it may mean chucking out your models. I'm coming out from someone who's come from a modelling background. I was never a mathematician, that sort of thing, but using water models, crop models to look at these things from biophysical perspective, and then having conversations with people about how we should manage things. But that narrows you right in as well. And once we started getting into the space of trying to look at or do research around inclusion and things, those sorts of approaches, it's an alien word full of different language and things to a lot of people, but it's also not appropriate. It doesn't open those conversations and things. So it's this sort of reflexive practice, I guess, as individuals, but also between the research team, to actually think about, well, where am I coming from? What am I bringing into this in terms of methods and tools and things? What works, what doesn't, and things. So you often end up trying to start something, go, okay, in terms of the systems thinking, this doesn't work, chuck that out. Oh, this one seems to get traction. So it really is that sort of negotiated practice, and as much as possible trying to dampen down your ego if it starts popping up.
And I would say there's still not 100% agreement within the team. I mean, we went into the midterm review last year not having a definition of inclusion, and we didn't want to have a definition. We had our pillars. We have come up, because we were told we need a definition, we have come up with a definition, and there's still dissent within our team who's been working for 4 years, but we've agreed to disagree that we need to have some kind of definition. And I think it's also about us all trusting each other and being prepared to work together as a research team, and then also building that trust within the communities. I'd also like to say that we started in COVID online. So our first 18 months of this project was online, incredibly difficult to do that, because a lot of the conversations work better when you're doing them face-to-face versus, somebody raising their hand, having those conversations over dinner and over tea. So yeah, it took us, I think, longer than if we'd had face-to-face meetings right from the start. And while I'm very pro online for many reasons, I think it is very challenging when you're working in complex projects to do, especially your startup and your kind of first year online. No, you can talk.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you to all of you, because it's fascinating. I love how you're thinking a bit out of the box around indicators and your mail. It's fantastic. Thank you. I was really intrigued by a particular comment. I think it was on the slide while Anton was talking. And it was something to the effect of understanding farmers' aspirations and challenges can support and enhance inclusion. I think about other projects that I'm familiar with. I might have expected that to be the other way around, that inclusion would support livelihoods, something like that. So I thought that was very interesting. Just therefore wondering, is inclusion the end of program outcome, if you want, that you're aiming for, or is there a bigger thing that you see it contributing to?
In the sense that inclusion is actually a process. That doesn't seem to be the end point. it seems like the end goal will have to be defined by whoever actually is within by the stakeholders themselves. So it actually starts with them, probably should end with them in terms of in terms of the work. The inclusion, in this sense, again, it's actually more like, okay, how do we get there, knowing that we need to weave back and forth into all these principles, sometimes allowing them to voice out and even provide dissension. But sometimes you need to be able to control it because, again, we have purposeful engagements, like you're part of a value chain, we are part of a project, we have engagements, obligations as well, etc. So yeah, it doesn't seem to be the end. It seems to be a description of that journey instead, of that narrative.
I might add, I'd probably think of it as being, yeah, but two-directional, that sort of link from inclusion to livelihoods or aspirations to that. I think often that, or what we've found with a couple of projects is that, you know, sometimes to build that relationship and trust, you actually need to achieve something that may not directly relate to your project outcomes, so inclusion in value chains, to actually get that sort of momentum or that build that sort of push. So in a previous project, and it's not us doing that, as the Australian researchers, it's our partners who work with communities. So in a previous project, one of our NGOs, you know, before we even got started on our research topic, it was around facilitating the caste registration in a village in India, which is basically, if you're recognised as belonging to that tribal group, that caste, it opens up a whole lot of access to resources that you're entitled to and things from government as well. So it had nothing to do with our project, but it was that necessary first step of addressing some of these aspirations or needs, immediate needs of the community, for us to then have the conversation around the project and the intention of that project. I don't know if that's a good example.
And in this project, something that came up was the health and not having access to health. So we negotiated with MWEL, which is a digital system, to actually be able to give farmers access to doctors online. It hasn't worked as well as we did, but we have tried because it came out as such a strong need that we have no access. It's so expensive for us to travel to go and see a doctor if we're ill. Can you set up something? But we've now also given feedback to this digital system, MWEL, and to the organization that these are the things you need to think about. So hopefully there'll be improvements from the project. Yeah.
And maybe just to build up another example for it, try to imagine that your activity, or let's say all of us, we work and we have, you know, our obligations, our deadlines, our outputs that are required of us. If we're asked to work harder, how do you actually achieve that? Is it just by pushing people to just work hard, or do you actually provide certain things like, okay, I'm gonna ask you to do overtime, but I will make sure that your children actually have education. I will actually I will make sure that they have access to an HMO service in case they actually get ill, or even you get ill. We're doing, now bring that idea to the farmers. The farmers, they're actually overburdened. Something that they've shared to us actually is that to be able to produce coffee, to be able to produce vegetables, these are labor-intensive work. If our intention is actually to go increase your yield or change your, cut down some of your trees, replace them with new varieties, et cetera, that is an additional work. additional work that actually does not provide additional income immediately. So the cost comes in, but the benefits actually will take another 2 to 3 years. In a scenario of poverty, that's pretty much death. That's hunger automatically. So if we're expecting them to do these kinds of things, we may need to have to provide those kinds of benefits, like a kind of health benefit, a kind of education benefit, the basic needs, the kinds of the safety and the security that's actually required of all. And again, maybe that alone should be able to become a springboard towards the long-term objectives, no matter what form of business model or value chain engagement you actually implement at the end.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the aspiration, as you know, the aspirations of the coffee farmers with regards to your question. I want to, in many cases in the Philippines, farming is intergenerational. And when it comes to coffee farmers, as of the moment, they are, the average age would be, 47 to 50s. So they are already at that age. So with the project, we are promoting, inclusion with the interventions that the project provided for the post-harvest facilities, and hoping that that will, improve the quality of the coffee beans. Following that, they will, be able to access diverse market and, of course, better income for them. And with better income, that will enable them to support the education of their children, which is really their aspirations. But come to think of it, coffee farming, facilitating the education of their children as of the moment. But if their children will be educated years from now, in many cases, these children are not taking, agriculture, forestry, that will, make them stay in coffee farming. So many years from now, their children will be working in cities and all. So that will be the unintended consequence of us promoting inclusion with the current farmers that we are working with. But in years from now, coffee farming may no longer be present in the area because the younger generation that is supposed to continue farming are now involved in other, livelihoods. So, yeah, I'm just not so sure. Yeah, well, inclusion as the, goal of the project as of the moment, but years from now, it may be totally different. It could be, I don't know, voluntary excluding yourselves from coffee farming because you already have other sources of income. You are now depending on the, what's the term? Remittances from your children working abroad because of you enabling them to get better education.
That may not make Nestle happy.
Yes?
I guess just as a provocation, is there some value in exclusion right now?
So in the context of, so try to imagine, again, the coffee farmer. The coffee farmer has income only once a year. It will be a lot of income, but it will be just once a year. In SK, that would be once within the months of October to March. Now, and as soon as you get your income, there's actually no other source of income because the remoteness of the area. There's actually not much business actually happening. So even if you put up a, let's say, barbecue stand, no one's going to buy because no one else actually has money as well to buy that barbecue. So your cash flow actually slumps, and they enter what's known as a season of crisis, where everything's there's just no cash. That's where you start getting informal loans, etc. So and then along the way, you also get a lot of, you're visited by typhoons, you're affected by, let's say, family feuds, creating violence, etc. This is a scenario which is very, very difficult. So if, in that sense, exclusion actually sounds very nice. It's trying to, how do I get out of this context that I'm in? And a lot of them are, again, aspiring to do that. And that's the reason why they want their children to be educated, to become professionals, just to be able to ensure that, one, their children do not have to face that same context, but at the same time, for them to also get indirect benefits to actually also get out of that context. So actually, right now, it makes more sense for them to get out. The exclusion actually has a higher value for these farmers rather than staying. So I think the bigger question for value chain analysis in the future actually has to do with how do we make them stay? How do we make them aspire to become better coffee farmers? Where does that value come from? That's actually the harder thing to answer at the moment, given what we've seen so far.
And it was one of Nestle's questions. So when we started engaging with Nestle, they said, it is so difficult for coffee farmers. Our prices are set by the market in London. We can't give them more. So now the coffee prices have gone up, as you know. I mean, if you drink cappuccino or any kind of coffee, you know your coffee has almost doubled in the last 4 years in terms of price. But they said, we know we have to diversify incomes for these farmers because otherwise they're already leaving and they may leave the area. So we have looked at some pathway diversity and some sort of alternative income sources. Problem with the area that we're working in is still post-conflict and there's not the infrastructure. There's not very good electricity, there's not good telecommunications. That's why we couldn't do the digital health system. There's a lot of things that go with having a value chain that functions. Coffee is easy because you dry it. It's easy to dry in the community and then you transport it out. But a lot of other products, like if you do chickens or vegetables, you can't, it's perishable. And so you can't transport it out. So at this stage, there's nothing at this stage that we can see, even though we've done an assessment. So yeah, for farmers, opting out of all agriculture is ultimately what they want to do for most of them.
But difficult to achieve because of these issues that Anton's talked about.
Yeah.
They're kind of stuck there, and I think that's the issue.
So does anybody have any other questions? Or comments on projects that you're running?
I think when I was going through the sessions and which ones really spoke to me and I wanted to attend, I looked at Philippines, I looked at value chain, and there's something I was interested in because I'm a modern slavery in engineering supply chain researcher, and even though my PhD was on modern slavery within the construction sector and ex-colony developing country context, I'm now looking at white-collar instances of modern slavery, and Philippines is one of my research area where I'm looking at IT supply chains. And so it did intrigue me, but I don't think that, was there anything that you came across within your research that dealt with exploitation, modern slavery practice, migrant laborers, and then how did you see inclusion there? It's a hypothetical question.
Yeah. Because we didn't, I wasn't doing this, but you didn't explicitly explore that.
At least for the value chains that we've investigated, one being coffee in Sultan Kudarat and the other in vegetables in Cebu City, which is pretty much a urbanized area. There have not been any instance of actual, in this case, any human organization doing coercive practices into these players or actors. The most coercive element in these spaces seem to be the environment itself, climate change factors, indirect results of political stuff. So it's not the instances of direct violence, and in this case exploitation through, let's say, slavery, does not seem to be happening. I wouldn't say that it doesn't happen in the Philippines. I'm pretty sure there are, let's say if we look into the crystal meth value chain, you will definitely see human slavery right there. But at least for the instances of the usual agriculture value chains, it doesn't happen. Now, that does not suggest that there are none of the players within these value chains would tend to have tendencies of becoming exploitative. Their informal loans tend to become exploitative to a certain extent, but they actually also have benefits. So, for example, most traders don't actually the core business of a trader is to get goods from farmer to the consumers. That's the function itself. You cannot take that out. That's important. Somebody has to take that function if you want to remove the trader from these value chains. But because they need that supply, and many of the farmers do not have enough cash for providing inputs, etc., that will actually translate to yields in the future. That's where the informal loans start to happen. These loans tend to be unfair in terms of the high interest rates, etc. But then, to a certain extent, the trader would say, "Well, I never forced them to take these loans. It was these farmers who accepted these loans from the start. So it's not my fault that they're not performing well, etc." And then they got involved in these seemingly perpetual loans. So, well, I'm not going to say that or forgive them for these kinds of acts, but in that sense, it's not. That's probably the more common kind of exploitation that actually happens there, and not so much into more direct activities.
I found something very similar in the construction sector where there's limited control. And sometimes when we think about modern slavery, it is not chattel slavery. It's like different things. Physical immobility is a trade-off chattel slavery. But in modern slavery, there's psychological immobility. There is financial immobility. So there are peaks and troughs like you discussed. And why aren't these people doing anything else in the trough period? Is there any sort of immobility which is covert? And it's really nuanced, I think. And even if we think about the voluntary nature of debt, I explore debt bondage in the construction sector as well. So there's this the common comment, it's voluntary, how can it be modern slavery? But then there are control dynamics, there is immobility on psychological and financial level that does skew it towards modern slavery. So again, it wasn't something that we were researching on, so I'm not the intended objective anyway.
I think we have to end. I just saw Valentina. I recall that we did have a conversation about exploitation, and it was in the context of our role as researchers going into community. What is our role? Are we exploiting by harvesting data, not doing anything about it? So we did have a chat about exploitation in that context. So as researchers, flying in, flying out, and what are we doing in terms of adverse events?
All right, so we've been given the time. It's tea time. Starts at 4:45, is that right? The next session? Yeah, so 4:45. Thank you so much for your time and the interesting questions. And we look forward to talking to you over tea and hearing about your projects. Thank you.